After 12 years, you're still doing this? Grant said it with a small laugh, looking at Marissa as if her answer had confirmed something he had always believed about her. Marissa lowered her eyes to the table for a second, not because she was embarrassed, because she was deciding whether he deserved an answer. Around them, the reunion continued, but the people sitting nearby had gone strangely quiet. Grant leaned back in his chair, completely comfortable, talking about his company, his properties, and everything he had built since their divorce. Then he looked at Marissa again. I always thought you'd eventually want more. Marissa slowly lifted her eyes to his. I did, she said. Grant smiled. He still didn't understand. Marissa reached for her phone and placed it on the table between them. Do you really want to know what I built? Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. Now, let's begin today's story. Grant's smile remained for another second. Then it disappeared. He looked at Marissa, waiting for her to explain herself. She didn't. Instead, she unlocked her phone. And what she was about to show him was something he had never once bothered to look for during the 12 years since their divorce. 12 years earlier, Marissa still believed that a good marriage was mostly about learning how to make room for another person. She and Grant had been married young, and in those first years, their differences felt almost comforting. Marissa worked in community services in Houston. Her days were usually filled with things that never made the news, helping somebody figure out how to catch a bus to work, calling a landlord, finding temporary housing for a family, or sitting across from a mother who had run out of ways to stretch a paycheck. She didn't make much money. Grant liked to tease her about that, not cruelly. At least, not then. You could charge people for all this advice, he would say, while she sorted paperwork at their kitchen table. They already think I'm charging them, she'd answer. He'd laugh, and she'd nudge his knee with hers. Grant was working his way up in commercial development. He talked about buildings the way Marissa talked about families. He knew which neighborhoods were growing, which properties were undervalued, and which investors were worth knowing. He wanted more. A better house, a better car, better connections. Eventually, his own development company. Marissa liked that about him. She liked watching him walk into a room and act as though he belonged there. Sometimes he pushed her too. You've got a degree. You're smart. Why are you acting like this is all you're capable of? She'd look up from whatever she was doing. Because I like what I do. I know. I'm saying you can like something bigger. She never had a good answer for that. And maybe that was part of why she loved him. Grant made her wonder whether she had been thinking too small. Marissa did something similar for him, though he didn't always recognize it. When Grant complained about people getting in the way of a project, she reminded him that those people had lives attached to the decisions he was making. When he talked about a neighborhood as an investment opportunity, she asked who was already living there. Sometimes he rolled his eyes. Sometimes he listened. For a while, they met somewhere in the middle. They had ordinary evenings, cheap takeout when money was tight, arguments over whose turn it was to wash dishes, Sunday mornings when neither wanted to get out of bed. They weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. They were young, in love, and convinced they had plenty of time to figure out the rest. The first changes were small enough that Marissa almost dismissed them. Grant started staying later at work. Then he started talking about work during dinner. He became more interested in who owned what, who was buying what, and who had managed to turn one property into 3. One evening, Marissa mentioned a family she'd helped keep from being evicted. Grant barely looked up from his phone. How much were they behind? 2 months. And they're going to catch up? I don't know. He nodded once. Then he went back to his phone. Marissa watched him for a moment. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even an argument. But something about the question stayed with her. He had once asked her about the people she helped. Now he was mostly asking whether helping them made sense. She didn't say anything. Not yet. Neither of them knew that those little differences were eventually going to become the things they couldn't forgive in each other. Grant's career began moving faster. The raises got better. The meetings got bigger. The names he mentioned at dinner became names Marissa recognized from business articles. He started taking her to professional events. At first, she enjoyed going. She liked seeing him confident. Then she began noticing how differently he behaved around successful people. He laughed more. He spoke more carefully. He talked about their future as if it were a business plan. "We need to get out of this neighborhood eventually," he said one night. Marissa looked up from her plate. "Why?" "Because we're not staying here forever." "I didn't say we were." Grant smiled. "That's exactly what I mean." She put her fork down. "What do you mean?" "You're comfortable." "Comfortable?" "Yeah. You don't seem hungry." Marissa stared at him. "I work every day." "You know what I'm talking about." She did. That was the problem. Grant wanted a bigger life, and he was beginning to measure the size of that life in ways she didn't fully understand. He wanted property, investments, connections. Marissa wanted stability. She wanted enough money that an emergency didn't become a disaster. She wanted to be able to help her mother if something happened. She wanted work that mattered when she came home. Neither goal was wrong. They just stopped sounding compatible. Their arguments became more frequent. Grant accused her of being afraid to take chances. Marissa accused him of taking chances because he couldn't stand feeling ordinary. That one hurt him. She knew it immediately. "That's not fair," he said. "I know." "Then why say it?" "Because I'm tired, Grant." He looked away. There were apologies after some arguments. Other times, they simply went to bed angry. Then Grant found an investment opportunity. He came home excited, barely taking off his jacket before spreading papers across the table. This could change everything. Marissa read through them. She wasn't an expert, but she understood enough to recognize the risk. "How much would we have to put in?" Grant told her. She looked back at the numbers. "That's most of our savings." "We'd make it back." "You don't know that." "I've done the research." "You've been excited about it for 3 days." "Because it's good." Marissa shook her head. "I think you should wait." Grant leaned against the counter. "Of course you do." She looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means you always do this." "Do what?" "Find the reason we shouldn't." She sat back. "I want you to succeed. I just don't want our entire financial future sitting on one investment." Grant was quiet. Then he said, "Sometimes I think you don't believe in me." Marissa's expression changed. "That isn't true." "Then believe me." She wanted to. That was what made the decision so difficult, because she wasn't choosing between Grant and some stranger. She was choosing whether to trust the man she had married, and Grant had already started treating her hesitation as an answer. Grant made the investment. He didn't tell Marissa that night. She found out the following morning when she saw the confirmation on his laptop. She stood in the doorway for several seconds. "You did it." Grant didn't turn around. "It's done. You said we'd talk about it." "We did." "No, we argued about it." He finally looked at her. "I made a decision. Our money, our future." Marissa folded her arms. "That's exactly why I needed you to listen." "I listened." "No, Grant, you heard me." He looked away. Neither of them knew what to say after that. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. Then the project started going wrong. Costs increased. The expected financing didn't come through. One delay became another. The investment that Grant had described as the thing that could change their lives became the thing that drained their savings. By the time they understood how bad it was, there was no easy way out. Grant became defensive whenever Marissa mentioned it. "You don't have to remind me." "I wasn't reminding you." "You keep asking about the money." "Because we need money." "I know that." "You're acting like I don't." He slammed a cabinet shut. Marissa went silent. After that, silence became easier than talking. Grant spent longer hours away from home. Marissa stopped asking when he'd be back. They ate separately. They slept facing opposite directions. The apartment that had once held their plans began holding their resentment instead. One night, Grant came home and sat across from her. "I think we're holding each other back." Marissa looked at him. She waited. He didn't take it back. "I need to be able to make decisions," he said. "I need to move forward. And you think I'm stopping you? I think we're different. We've always been different. Not like this." Marissa looked down at her hands. She wanted him to say he was angry. She wanted him to say they could fix it. Instead, he said, "Maybe we were good for each other once." That sentence stayed with her. The divorce wasn't explosive. There was paperwork. There were meetings. There were boxes. There were things they couldn't agree on, and then things they stopped caring enough to argue about. When Marissa finally left, she took her clothes, a few household items, and an old notebook that had belonged to her grandmother. Grant stayed behind. For a long time, Marissa believed that meant he had won. She was the one starting over. He was the one moving forward. And somewhere in the back of her mind, one painful thought kept returning. Maybe Grant had been right. Maybe she simply hadn't wanted enough. 3 weeks after the divorce, Marissa was still finding pieces of her old life in the wrong places. A coffee mug Grant had bought her sat beside the sink. One of his old shirts was still hanging behind the bedroom door. She finally put the shirt in a donation bag. Then she stood there for a while, looking at it. Her new apartment was small enough that she could hear the refrigerator kick on from the bedroom. The kitchen had barely enough counter space for a cutting board and a coffee maker. She told herself it was temporary. She didn't know how temporary. At work, she became quieter. People noticed. "You okay?" a coworker asked one afternoon. "Yeah." The answer came too quickly. The coworker didn't push. Marissa appreciated that. Grant, meanwhile, seemed to be doing fine. Through mutual acquaintances, she occasionally heard about his work. A new opportunity, a new client, another project. Nobody said his name with sympathy. They said it with admiration. Marissa hated that this bothered her. She didn't want to be jealous of him. She wanted to stop caring. At night, she sometimes opened the old notebook that had belonged to her grandmother. Most of the pages contained ordinary things: addresses, grocery notes, bits of advice, names of people her grandmother had helped over the years. Marissa began writing in the blank pages, not about Grant, mostly about work, families she had met, problems she couldn't solve, things she wished she understood. One night, after a particularly difficult day, she wrote, "There has to be a better way." Then she closed the notebook. The next morning, she went back to work. Her circumstances hadn't changed, but something inside her had started looking for a different answer. It happened gradually. One family needed help finding an apartment. Another needed transportation to a new job. A father had finally found employment, but couldn't afford the deposit on a place to live. A mother had stable housing until her car broke down, and without the car, she couldn't get to work. Marissa began keeping notes. At first, it was simply because she was tired of forgetting details. Then, she started noticing the pattern. The same families were often fighting several problems at once. Housing affected employment. Employment affected transportation. Transportation affected housing. One afternoon, Marissa sat across from a woman who had just lost her job. "You have another interview?" Marissa asked. "Tomorrow." "That's good." The woman shook her head. "I don't have a way there." Marissa paused. "Bus?" "2 buses. One doesn't run early enough." Marissa looked down at the file. The woman wasn't refusing to work. She was trapped by the distance between where she lived and where opportunity existed. That stayed with Marissa. Later that week, she brought the idea up at work. What if we stopped treating these as separate problems? A coworker looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Help somebody keep housing while we help them get stable employment, work with employers, transportation when we can, something connected." "That's a lot." "I know. And who's paying for it?" Marissa smiled faintly. "That part I haven't figured out." Someone laughed. She laughed too, but she kept thinking about it. Within weeks, she had begun putting together a rough proposal. It wasn't impressive. There were no big offices or major donors behind it. Just a few pages, some numbers, and a problem she couldn't stop seeing. When her supervisor asked why she was so determined, Marissa shrugged. I keep meeting people who are one bad week away from losing everything." She didn't mention Grant. She didn't need to. For the first time since the divorce, the thing keeping her awake at night wasn't what she had lost. It was what she might be able to build. The program began with a borrowed office and 2 desks that didn't match. One computer worked properly. The other froze whenever too many applications were open. Marissa kept a handwritten list of families taped beside her monitor. She made mistakes. A funding application was rejected. A potential partner backed out. One family she had promised to help ended up finding another solution before Marissa could do anything. That one bothered her more than she admitted. "You can't save everybody," her coworker told her. "I know." "You don't act like you know." Marissa smiled. "I'm working on it." The first real breakthrough came with a family who had been moving between temporary housing and relatives' homes. The father found work through one of the program's employer connections. Marissa helped the family secure stable housing. Months later, the mother walked into the office holding a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Their children were standing in front of their new home. "We wanted you to have this." Marissa looked at the picture. "You don't have to give me anything. We know." The woman smiled. "That's why we're giving it to you." After they left, Marissa sat alone at her desk. She looked at the photograph again, then at the old notebook beside her. The program wasn't fixed. It wasn't financially secure. There were still more families than they could help. But something was working. The referrals increased. An employer asked whether they could partner on another job placement effort. A local official wanted to meet. Then another organization called. Marissa's days became longer. Her responsibilities grew. She learned how to ask for money without apologizing. She learned that leadership sometimes meant telling people no. She learned that being compassionate didn't mean avoiding difficult decisions. And somewhere along the way, she stopped wondering whether Grant would have considered her work successful. She stopped imagining what he would say if he could see her now. That realization came quietly. She was sitting at her desk late one evening when she noticed she hadn't thought about him all day. She looked at the clock. Almost midnight. For the first time, she understood that she had been building a life without waiting for anyone from her old one to approve it. And she wasn't finished yet. The first time Marissa realized the organization had outgrown her, she was standing in the hallway outside a meeting room, listening to 2 staff members argue over a spreadsheet. "You changed the numbers." "I corrected them." "You didn't tell me." "I thought you knew." Marissa leaned against the wall and waited. 3 years earlier, she had been the person doing nearly everything herself. Now there were enough employees for mistakes to happen without her knowing about them immediately. That should have felt like success. Instead, it scared her. She walked into the room. "Okay, what happened?" They both started talking. Marissa held up a hand. "One at a time." They looked at each other. She almost laughed. This was what growth looked like, apparently. More people, more problems, more people creating problems for other people. But it also meant something else. The work was no longer dependent on her being in every room. The housing program had expanded. The workforce initiative had become a real operation. Employers were contacting them directly about workers. Families were being referred by organizations that had once ignored them. And the little office with 2 mismatched desks had become something much larger. The growth wasn't smooth. There were months when funding came in late and payroll became a problem. One project failed after months of preparation. A staff member she trusted left unexpectedly. Another made a decision that nearly damaged an important partnership. Marissa made mistakes too. She once pushed a program forward because she believed in it before she had enough evidence that the community actually needed it. It cost money. Her board wasn't pleased. One member told her, "You can't lead from instinct every time." She didn't argue. She went home and wrote that sentence in her notebook. The next morning, she changed the program. That was one of the things Grant never saw. Marissa didn't become confident because she stopped being wrong. She became confident because she learned she could be wrong without falling apart. By then, she was sitting in meetings with city officials and developers, discussing housing initiatives with people who had once seemed impossibly far above her. Sometimes she caught herself remembering Grant's old voice. "You need to think bigger." She would almost smile. He had been right about one thing. She had needed to think bigger. He just hadn't understood what bigger meant to her. Across Houston, Grant's company was growing too. He had the projects, the money, the polished office, and the professional reputation he'd once wanted so badly. Their lives had both moved forward. They simply hadn't moved in the same direction, and neither man nor woman knew yet that those two paths were about to cross again. There was a time when Marissa checked her phone after every major accomplishment, not because she expected Grant to call. She just wondered whether someone would mention it to him. The first major partnership came through. She wondered if a mutual acquaintance might tell him. When the organization received a significant grant, she imagined him hearing about it somewhere. When a local official praised her work publicly, she caught herself thinking, he'd be surprised. Then one afternoon she realized she hadn't thought about Grant in weeks. She was sitting in her office with a stack of reports beside her when a coworker walked in. "You're needed in 5 minutes." Marissa looked at the clock. "Already?" "Yep." She gathered her papers. As she stood, she noticed the old notebook on the corner of her desk. She opened it without thinking. Years earlier, she'd written Grant's name in one of the margins. Not a love note, not anything dramatic, just his name beside a list of things she had wanted to prove. She stared at it. Then she closed the notebook. That was it. No anger, no sadness. She simply realized she didn't need the list anymore. Later that week, someone mentioned Grant during a professional conversation. Marissa was surprised by how little she felt. "Oh," she said. "How is he?" The other person shrugged. "Seems good. His company is doing well." "That's good." And she meant it. That surprised her more than anything. For years, part of her had imagined success as a kind of answer. She'd pictured a day when Grant would hear about her organization and finally understand what he had walked away from. But now that possibility didn't feel satisfying. It actually felt exhausting. She had spent too many years measuring herself against a man who wasn't even present. Her organization had become successful because she had learned how to make difficult decisions, listen to people, admit mistakes, and keep going when things didn't work. None of that belonged to Grant. None of it needed his approval. That realization changed how she carried herself. She stopped explaining her work when people questioned it. She stopped apologizing for caring about families who couldn't offer her anything professionally. She stopped comparing community impact to somebody else's bank account, and she became more comfortable saying, "I don't know," when she didn't. Her work continued growing. So did her life outside it. She made friends she hadn't known during her marriage. She learned how to enjoy quiet evenings without feeling like she was waiting for somebody to come home. She bought furniture she actually liked. She traveled occasionally. Nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside, but Marissa noticed the difference. Her life no longer felt like something she was rebuilding. It felt like something she owned. Then, one Friday afternoon, an email arrived. She almost deleted it because she didn't recognize the sender. It was an invitation to a reunion for people connected to the years when she and Grant had been married. Marissa read it once, then again. Her thumb hovered over the screen. For 12 years, she'd never gone looking for the past. Now the past had found her. Marissa left the email open on her screen until her computer went to sleep. She could have ignored it. Nobody would have blamed her. There were people attending who hadn't seen her since the divorce. People who had known her when she was still trying to figure out what kind of life she wanted. People who had watched her marriage to Grant fall apart without necessarily understanding why. She closed the email, then opened it again. Her first instinct was to say no. Her second was to wonder why she cared. That irritated her. She wasn't afraid of seeing Grant. At least, that's what she told herself. Still, when she finally accepted the invitation, she didn't tell anyone at work. She didn't even mention it to her closest friend until the week of the event. "You're actually going?" Marissa shrugged. "I said I'd go." "Are you sure?" "I can leave if I don't like it." Her friend smiled. "That wasn't what I meant." "I know." Marissa laughed softly. That was the end of the conversation. She didn't spend weeks choosing an outfit or rehearsing what she might say to Grant. She wasn't interested in making an entrance. She wasn't bringing awards or photographs or anything that would announce what she'd accomplished. She simply went. Grant received the same invitation several weeks earlier. He accepted almost immediately. For him, the reunion felt easier. His life had gone according to the version of success he'd imagined when he was young. His development company was established. He had money, professional contacts, a comfortable home, the kind of career that made people listen when he spoke. He had occasionally wondered what had become of Marissa, but never enough to actually find out. When mutual acquaintances mentioned her, he usually remembered the woman from their marriage, the one who worried about money, the one who hesitated before taking risks, the one who had spent her days helping people who, in his old view, could never give anything back. He didn't know about the organization. He didn't know how large it had become. He didn't know that people he considered important in Houston now knew Marissa by reputation. Most importantly, he didn't know that she had stopped thinking about him. The night of the reunion, Marissa arrived early. She recognized the room before she recognized most of the people in it. A few familiar faces greeted her. Someone hugged her. Someone else said, "Marissa? Oh my God, I almost didn't recognize you." She laughed. "It's been a while." It really has. The conversation moved on. Marissa relaxed. Maybe this hadn't been such a bad idea. Then the room changed. She noticed it before she turned around. Several people near the entrance looked toward the door. Someone said Grant's name. Marissa's hand stopped halfway to her glass. She looked over. Grant stood near the entrance, talking to two men she didn't recognize. He looked older, not dramatically, just enough that she could see the years. His hair was different. His face was leaner. He carried himself with the same confidence she remembered. Then he looked across the room. Their eyes met. Grant stopped talking. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Marissa had imagined this moment years ago. In those old fantasies, she had always felt something powerful. Anger, satisfaction, regret. She felt none of those things, just recognition. Grant slowly walked toward her. "Marissa." She gave him a small smile. "Hi, Grant." He looked at her a little longer than necessary. "How have you been?" "Good." He nodded. Yeah. There was an awkward pause. Then Grant smiled. "I heard you were still doing community work." Marissa's expression barely changed. "I'm still in community development." He gave a quiet laugh. "Wow." Then he looked around the room. "And after all these years?" His eyes returned to her. "You're still doing that?" Marissa didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him. And for the first time that night, she began to wonder whether Grant had any idea who he was actually standing in front of. Grant was still standing in front of Marissa when someone from across the room called his name. He glanced over his shoulder. "Give me a second." Then he looked back at her. "So," he said, "community development." Marissa nodded. "That's what I do." Grant smiled, as if the answer confirmed something. "You always did care about that stuff." Marissa took a sip of her drink. "I still do." He studied her for another moment. She had expected him to look older. He did. But what caught her off guard was how familiar his manner still was. The slight tilt of his head when he was evaluating something, the way he kept one hand in his pocket while talking, even the small smile he used when he thought he understood a situation better than everyone else. It brought back a version of herself she hadn't visited in years. Grant glanced around the room. "So are you still working at that community center?" "No." "What are you doing now?" "I run an organization." He paused. "Your own?" "Yes." That seemed to interest him for about 2 seconds. "What kind?" Marissa explained it simply. They worked with families facing housing instability and helped connect them with employment, transportation resources, and other support. Grant listened. Then he nodded. "That's good." There was something about the way he said it that made the compliment feel smaller than it should have. "Thanks," Marissa said. A woman nearby walked over and hugged Marissa. "I've been meaning to meet you properly," she said. "I heard your name at that housing partnership meeting last year." Marissa smiled. "Oh, really?" "Yes, your team helped with that workforce piece, right?" "Part of it." The woman turned to Grant. "You know Marissa's organization?" Grant looked at Marissa. "Not really." The woman seemed surprised. "You should. They've done some impressive work." Grant gave a short laugh. I guess we've been in different circles. Marissa didn't correct him. The woman was pulled away by someone else, leaving the two of them standing there again. Grant took a drink. You've been busy then? Yeah, pretty busy. Must be a lot of work. It is. He nodded slowly. I always thought you'd eventually move into something more. He stopped. Marissa waited. More what? Grant smiled. I don't know. Bigger. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because 12 years earlier, she had spent so much time wondering whether he was right. Now she wasn't sure what answer he expected. Before she could respond, someone called Grant over to another group. He lifted his glass toward them. I should go say hello. Sure. He took 2 steps, then turned back. It was good seeing you. You too. Grant walked away. Marissa watched him join the others. Within seconds, he was talking about a development project, gesturing towards someone who appeared genuinely interested. She looked down at her glass. For a moment, she wondered what would happen if he ever learned how much had changed since the divorce. Then she dismissed the thought. She hadn't come here for that. But across the room, Grant glanced back at her, and the expression on his face suggested he hadn't finished deciding what he thought of her. About 20 minutes later, Grant ended up at Marissa's table. There were 6 people there, most of them talking about work. Grant pulled out a chair. Mind if I sit? Marissa moved her purse from the seat beside her. Go ahead. He sat down. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed harmless. Someone mentioned rising property costs. Another person talked about a recent office expansion. Grant had plenty to say about both. Marissa listened. Then, someone asked her about her organization. We're working on a new housing and employment initiative, she said. Grant turned toward her. Still? Marissa looked at him. Still? He smiled. I don't mean that badly. You don't have to explain. No, seriously. I just remember you being so passionate about that stuff. I am. He nodded. Right. There was a pause. Then Grant said, I guess everybody has their thing. One of the people at the table shifted in her chair. Marissa didn't react. Grant continued talking about his company. He mentioned a recent project, then another. He spoke comfortably about investors and land acquisition and how difficult it was to make large projects work in Houston. Someone asked how he got started. Grant laughed. Honestly, I just stopped being afraid of making big decisions. Marissa looked down at her glass. She knew exactly where that sentence was going. Grant glanced at her. Remember how we used to argue about that? Marissa said nothing. You'd worry about everything. I had reasons. I know. He smiled. That's what I mean. The conversation became quieter. Grant leaned back. I always thought you'd eventually get tired of playing it safe. Marissa looked at him. Playing it safe? Come on. No. I'm asking. He rubbed his jaw. I just mean you were always comfortable helping everybody else. One person at the table looked toward him. Grant. He waved it off. I'm not insulting her. Then he looked at Marissa again. I always knew you weren't really interested in success the way I was. There it was. The old sentence, in a new room. For half a second, Marissa felt herself sitting at their old kitchen table again, listening to the man she loved explain why she didn't understand ambition. Her fingers tightened around the glass, then relaxed. She looked at Grant. You still think that? He shrugged. I mean, look at us. He gestured casually between them. I took risks, built something. You chose a completely different path. Marissa glanced around the table. Nobody was eating anymore. Grant didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did. I just always thought, he continued, that if you'd wanted more, you'd have gone after it. Marissa let out a quiet breath. What makes you think I didn't? Grant smiled. Marissa, come on. She didn't answer. Someone tried to change the subject. So, Marissa, how many people does your organization? Grant interrupted. I mean, she's always been good at helping people. Marissa looked at him. That was the moment she understood something. He hadn't really been asking about her life. He had been comparing it to his. And 12 years later, he was still convinced he had won. Marissa placed her glass on the table. Grant. Yeah? Do you actually want to know what I've been doing for the last 12 years? His smile returned. Sure. He said it casually, almost kindly, as if he already knew the answer. Marissa reached for her phone, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Marissa unlocked her phone and opened an email. She turned the screen slightly toward Grant. It wasn't a personal message. It was a photograph from a housing project her organization had recently completed. Grant looked at it, then at her. What is this? Our latest housing partnership. He studied the image. Your organization did this? Part of it. He scrolled. There were more photographs. Families standing outside newly renovated homes. Employees at a workforce training event. A community meeting. A group of local employers. Grant's expression changed slowly. Wait. Marissa said nothing. How big is this? She gave him the number. Grant looked at the screen again. That many? Over the years. One of the women at the table leaned closer. I told you, she said. Her organization is doing really good work. Grant didn't answer. Another person recognized the organization's name. I've heard of them. Didn't they partner with the city? We've had several partnerships, Marissa said. And some developers too, right? Some. Grant looked at her. Developers? Yes. There was no accusation in her voice. That seemed to bother him more than if there had been. He had spent the evening describing his own development work as though Marissa's career existed somewhere completely outside his world. Now he was discovering that the two worlds had been closer than he realized. The woman beside him asked Marissa about one of the programs. Marissa explained it simply. Grant listened. She talked about helping families remain housed while connecting adults with employers and transportation resources. No grand claims, no attempt to impress anyone, just facts. Someone asked how many people the organization had helped. Marissa answered. Grant stopped moving. He looked down at the table. 12 years earlier, he had watched her spend evenings helping families who had almost nothing. He had seen it as proof that she lacked ambition. Now he was sitting beside a woman who had turned that same concern into an organization that had affected hundreds of lives. He remembered telling her she was too cautious. That memory didn't fit the woman sitting beside him. Grant cleared his throat. I didn't know. Marissa locked her phone. You didn't ask. He looked at her. There was no accusation in her face. That made the sentence land harder. I should have. She shrugged slightly. Maybe. Someone at the table asked Marissa another question, and she answered. Grant remained quiet. For once, he wasn't the person carrying the conversation. After a few minutes, he leaned toward her. You've done really well. Marissa looked at him. Thank you. He seemed to expect something else. A smile. A little satisfaction. Maybe even a reminder of what he'd said 12 years ago. She gave him none of it. She simply turned back toward the conversation. Grant sat there for another minute before excusing himself. He walked toward the other side of the room, but his pace was slower than before. Marissa watched him go only briefly. Then she returned to the conversation. She didn't need to follow him with her eyes. What Grant had just discovered was bigger than the size of her organization. He had spent 12 years believing Marissa's life had become smaller after their divorce. He was beginning to understand that he had never actually known what her life became. Grant found Marissa near the side entrance after most of the guests had started leaving. She was checking something on her phone when he stopped a few feet away. Can I talk to you? Marissa looked up. For a moment, she considered saying no. Not because she was angry. She simply wasn't sure there was anything left to say. About what? Grant glanced toward the room. Not here. Marissa slipped her phone into her purse. Okay. They walked toward a quieter hallway. Grant stopped near a window overlooking the parking lot. For several seconds, he said nothing. Marissa waited. Finally, he said, I didn't know. I figured. No, I mean it. I really didn't know. She nodded. Grant rubbed his hands together. I thought you were still doing the same kind of work. I was. That isn't what I meant. I know. He looked at her. I remembered you differently. Marissa's eyes stayed on him. How? He hesitated. Like you were afraid to take chances. She almost smiled. I was afraid sometimes. So was I. Grant looked down. I just thought you didn't have the ambition. Marissa leaned against the wall. That was never the problem. What was? She took a breath. I didn't want the same things you wanted. Grant nodded slowly. I know that now. Back then, she had wanted him to understand that. She had wanted him to stop treating every disagreement as proof that she was holding him back. But standing there 12 years later, she didn't feel the need to convince him. Grant looked toward the parking lot. After we divorced, everything started going better for me. Marissa said nothing. I got the company going. Projects worked out. I made money. I know. He glanced at her. You knew? People talk. He gave a small, embarrassed laugh. Yeah. There was another silence. I used that, he said. Marissa frowned slightly. Used what? The success. He swallowed. I told myself it proved I made the right decision. Marissa looked away. Grant continued. Every time something went well, I thought, see, this is what would have happened if I'd stayed focused. She didn't interrupt him, and I guess that made it easier not to think about what happened to you. Marissa's expression changed slightly. I wondered about you too. Grant looked surprised. Really? After the divorce? And then? She looked at him. Then I stopped. He nodded, though he seemed to need a second to understand what she meant. Marissa continued quietly. There were years when I wanted you to know I'd be okay. Grant looked at her. I wanted you to regret leaving. His face tightened. I didn't know that. You weren't supposed to. She gave a small shrug. I was hurt. I know. No, you know now. Grant lowered his eyes. She continued. I spent a long time wondering if you'd been right about me, that maybe I wasn't ambitious enough. Maybe I had settled for too little. He looked back at her. But you didn't. No. She paused. I just had to figure out what enough meant to me. Grant didn't answer. For the first time that night, he seemed to understand that the woman standing in front of him wasn't waiting for him to admit she had won. She wasn't keeping score anymore, and somehow that was harder for him to face than anything she could have said. Grant stayed by the window. I was unfair to you, he said. Marissa didn't answer right away. He looked at her. I said things I shouldn't have. You did. He nodded. I thought if I worked harder and took bigger risks, everything would eventually make sense. Marissa gave him a faint, tired smile. Did it? Grant looked toward the parking lot again. Not exactly. That answer seemed to cost him something. He wasn't asking her to forgive the divorce. He wasn't asking whether they could start over. He was simply saying what he hadn't been capable of saying when they were married. I made you feel like what mattered to you was less important, he said. Marissa looked down. That hurt. I know. She shook her head gently. I don't think you did know. Grant accepted that. You're right. There was no argument after that. No defense. No explanation about how young they had been. No attempt to blame the failed investment or the pressure of his career. Just two people finally sitting with what they had done to each other. After a moment, Grant asked, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed together? Marissa looked out the window. Yes. He waited. Sometimes. What do you think? She smiled faintly. I think we'd have become two very unhappy people. Grant laughed under his breath. Probably. Maybe not forever. Maybe. She turned toward him. But I don't wish it back. That was the answer he hadn't expected. Grant nodded slowly. Because of everything you built? Marissa shook her head. Not just that. She thought for a moment. Because I like who I became. Grant looked at her. She didn't say it proudly. She said it almost matter-of-factly. That seemed to stay with him. You really don't hate me, he said. Marissa's eyebrows lifted. I don't. Why? Because I don't think hating you would give me anything back. He smiled sadly. That sounds like something you would have said to me 12 years ago. No. She looked at him. 12 years ago, I would have said it and hoped you'd understand. Grant's smile disappeared. Marissa continued. Now I don't need you to. He looked down. The apology had finally reached the place where it needed to go. Not into a reconciliation, not into another chance, just into the past. Grant nodded. I am sorry, Marissa. She held his gaze. I believe you. He seemed relieved. Then she added, but I'm still glad we ended. Grant let out a quiet breath. Yeah. Neither of them smiled, but neither looked away. The marriage was over. It had been over for 12 years. What they were finally putting to rest that night was something different, the version of the past that each of them had carried alone. When they returned to the reunion, they didn't walk back together. They went in separately, and that felt right. The next Monday, Marissa arrived at the office before most of her staff. She put her bag down and turned on the lights. Someone had left a stack of folders on her desk. A staff member needed help with a housing application. Another employee had a meeting with an employer that morning. There was a voicemail from a family waiting for an update. Nothing about the morning looked extraordinary. That was exactly why Marissa liked it. She sat down and opened the first file. A few minutes later, one of her employees walked in. Morning. Morning? You get home late Saturday? Marissa smiled. Pretty late. How was the reunion? She thought about Grant standing by the window. It was interesting. That sounds suspicious. Marissa laughed. It wasn't. The employee grinned and walked away. Marissa returned to her paperwork. A phone rang. Someone answered it. Across the room, another staff member was helping a family complete forms. A few minutes later, an employer called about a job placement. It was ordinary work, but Marissa looked around the office and remembered the tiny room where all of this had started. 2 mismatched desks, 1 unreliable computer, a handwritten list of families, a woman who wasn't sure she could make payroll. She opened the old notebook. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the first pages. Marissa turned to one of her own entries from years earlier. There has to be a better way. She smiled. There had been. It just hadn't arrived all at once. It had come through failed programs, difficult meetings, rejected funding requests, long nights, good people, bad decisions, second chances, and families who kept walking through the door. That was what she had built. Not something designed to make Grant regret leaving. Not proof that she was better than him. Something useful. Something that continued helping people, even when she wasn't in the room. Marissa closed the notebook. Her phone buzzed. A message from a staff member said a family had finally been approved for housing. Marissa typed back, "That's wonderful. Thank you for staying on it." Then she put the phone down. Years earlier, the young woman leaving her marriage had carried that same notebook, a few belongings, and a belief that her life had somehow fallen behind. Marissa wished she could sit beside that woman for 5 minutes. She wouldn't tell her everything. She'd just tell her to keep going. Because the life ahead wasn't going to look like the one she had planned. It was going to become something better suited to who she actually was. And Grant had spent 12 years believing Marissa had failed to build the life she wanted. The truth was simpler. She had built one he had never learned how to see.